Hey folks, RegisKillbin here, and Snip Snap has joined the battle. That's right, the Rise of the Mech event has arrived, and with it, a free golden legendary Snip Snap. All you have to do is log into Hearthstone, and he's yours. And of course, that means you're going to be wondering what kind of decks you can use to play your awesome shiny new card. And I've got 5 decks that will fit him very nicely. Now, some of these decks are going to look familiar because they're things you've already seen in the Hearthstone meta, both in standard and wild format, but they just welcome Snip Snap right in as a perfect piece of the puzzle for making them even stronger. But I've also got a theory crafted list in this video using both Snip Snap and some of the new buffed cards that are also arriving with the Rise of the Mech event that I think might finally turn the corner and make Pogo Rogue a real possibility. So that said, let's go ahead and talk through all 5 of these lists that you can use Snip Snap in right now on day 1. Up first here, I have a version of Mech, or sometimes called Bomb Hunter, which is really one of the best decks in Hearthstone right now in standard format. And you'll note here, this list looks pretty familiar if you've seen them before. Not anything surprising, a nice package of mechs that help you curve out beautifully until you eventually just overwhelm your opponents with raw damage via bombs and magnetic mech attacks. But there are a few new things here, including, of course, our friend Snip Snap, which with his magnetic and death rattle aspects is perfect for a deck like this, just stacking him on curve, or sometimes even just playing him out as a mech with a lot of resiliency and survivability is going to be perfect for how this deck likes to play. But beyond that, I've also added in here Necro Mechanic, which if you didn't hear, is getting buffed as a part of the Rise of the Mech event, going down to 4 mana instead of 5, which fits this deck both from a curve standpoint really nicely because that's a reasonably statted minion, but also because there are so many interesting death rattles in this deck. You've got the token mech summoning death rattles like your Mecharoos and your Snip Snaps and your Replicating Menace, but you've also got those really high impact death rattles like Spider Bomb, for instance. So sometimes getting a Spider Bomb and a Necro Mechanic going off together is very powerful because doubling that minion removal is just ridiculous. But also, a lot of bombs means if you can activate a ton of bombs using an Necro Mechanic on board, you're just going to be putting out ridiculous amounts of damage and overwhelming your opponent with all those little 2 damage hits to their face. So clearly a deck that's already worked really well right now in Hearthstone, and I think Snip Snap and Necro Mechanic are both just going to add to that power level. So I expect this to be one of the best decks in this new buff/Snip Snap Rise of the Mech meta. So if you're looking for something that's very reliable and is almost certainly going to work, a list that looks like this one is going to be perfect for you. Moving on here, let's take a look at my second deck, Mech Token Druid. Now, you've probably seen some Token Druids out there on the Hearthstone ladder. It's a very popular deck right now and a very good one as well. But this list might look a little bit different because it relies more on a mech package that the traditional or more popular list does not. But I've seen a lot of data and a lot of pro players who like the mech version of the list better. And this new take on that already established Mech Token Druid, of course, includes our friend Snip Snap, because he's absolutely perfect for what this deck wants to do. With all Token Druids, you're hoping to find a board state where you have a nice wide board of multiple minions sticking around so that you can use your buffs, things like Soul of the Forest, Blessing of the Ancients, or just your Savage Roars to overwhelm your opponent with either stats on board or just lots of face damage. And sticky, resilient mechs, things like Mecharoos with a nice death rattle, Replicating Menace that leaves behind a few mechs, and of course Snip Snap, which now has a multi-mech death rattle. Those are all perfect for what this deck wants to do. And because you're leaving behind those mechs on board often, that makes Magnetic a really powerful play too. Things like Replicating Menace and Snip Snap are perfect when you can magnetize them on a mech that's been left behind and do things with a much bigger and more immediately impactful sort of minion. So this list is another proven way to play a mech package that Snip Snap is just the perfect complementary piece for. It's almost like he was designed for a deck like this because he's good magnetic on turn 3, he's good on his own turn 3, and beyond that, on turn 6, you can play multiple Snip Snaps thanks to the Echo, or on turn 9, use it as yet another incredibly resilient reload. And that's what this deck does really well with things like Forest 8. It just keeps coming back for another round of a wide board of minions. Snip Snap fits that beautifully, and that's why I think he's going to be a masterpiece in this deck. Up next here for my third deck, I have a Mech Paladin build, and of course all of these are mech-centered decks which shouldn't really surprise you too much since, of course, Snip Snap operates best with mechs. But this is a version of a Paladin list that's gained a lot of ground recently in the Hearthstone ladder. There are a few different ways to play kind of mech packages of Paladin, but this one with things like Glowstone Technician and Crystology and Call to Adventure, these sort of complementary pieces, as I'd call them, that don't go down the traditional mech path, is perfect for the Rise of the Mech event because both Crystology and Glowstone Technician are getting buffed. They're each getting their mana cost reduced by 1, which means you're getting like the full Rise of the Mech package here. You're getting buffs, and Snip Snap fits in nicely as well. And this is yet another deck that just relies on a very smooth curve, much like the Mech Hunter. You're just trying to play things out as quickly as you can, using all of your mana at any given turn so that you build a nice resilient board and you just overwhelm your opponent with stats and big stuff. And Magnetic allows you to do that really nicely. And you can see in this deck there's a pretty strong mid to late game package as well, with huge Magnetic cards like War Gears and Missile Launchers, big base mechs like Mechano Egg. So eventually you're just going to play so many giant things that they just can't resolve at all. Now, there is one thing to note about this deck. The card Kangor's Endless Army is not perfect for Snip Snap because Snip Snap does leave behind Death Rattle mech cards, which means if one of those 1/1s for Snip Snap dies and then you play a Kangor's Endless Army, there is a small chance you could resurrect a 1/1 and that would disrupt the power level of your Kangor's Endless Army a little bit, which might make you nervous. But I think the good news, and you'll find if you play this deck a lot, is that you don't always have a Kangor's Endless Army. It's not a definite win condition in every matchup, and when it is, you can maybe hold off on your Snip Snap. So having the consistency of an early to mid game really powerful Magnetic card and a reload card is worth more to me than the slight downside of an anti-synergy with Kangor's Endless Army. In other words, you can make decisions with how you play this deck that don't create that problem. And then in every other scenario, Snip Snap is just so good on curve and so powerful as another Magnetic option to just stack your stuff really tall and make big Magnetic behemoth dudes that it doesn't really matter if those cards don't fit perfectly. The rest of the deck suits the card so well that Snip Snap is still worth it. And hey, if you don't have Kangor's Endless Army, even better, you can build yourself a slightly more budget version of this list and still use Snip Snap rather nicely. So now let's talk about my theory crafted deck here. This is a take on Pogo Hopper Rogue, and I just want to be clear, this is not a proven archetype, and in fact, it's one that really struggles. So don't go out there and craft this deck hoping that it's the next tier 1 super deck that's going to drive you all the way to legend. It might be okay. It might eventually get great after some refinements, but for now, this is more about fun and experimenting with a new idea than it is about like consistency and performance. And what this deck does differently is because, of course, Pogo Hopper is getting buffed in the Rise of the Mech event down to 1 mana, which opens up a really cool interaction between Pogo Hopper and Magic Carpet so that you can give your Pogo Hoppers Rush when you play them. Now, you also get +1 attack, but that's probably not all that relevant on giant Pogo Hoppers. The real advantage is that sometimes in the past when you played Pogo Hoppers, you just sort of sit there helpless and defenselessly because you spent a turn developing all these big minions, but your opponent just hits you in the face and you die. But if you have Rush when you play those big minions, suddenly you can also clear your opponent's board at the same time, so it gives you a lot more reactivity and it makes you a lot less defenseless. And when you combine that with other mech magnetic support cards like Bronze Gatekeeper, Snip Snap, of course, and Ziliax, then suddenly you're looking at a deck that has a lot more flexibility, I think a little bit more survivability, and potentially just a higher power level. So if you're not familiar with this list at all, the idea here is to play lots of Pogo Hoppers, shuffle more Pogo Hoppers into your deck via things like Togwaggle Scheme, Talk Whisker. Of course, Augmented Elec can help you do that nicely as well. And you just keep replaying them, keep getting bigger and bigger minions, and eventually overwhelm your opponent with absolutely enormous Pogo Hoppers. And I think now this deck has a better chance than ever to succeed. I think it will still be tough, but thanks to that Magic Carpet interaction, thanks to some new support cards, maybe this could get there. We'll just have to keep an eye on this one and experiment with it a lot. I'm hopeful, but I'm sure not confident just yet. And then finally here, I wanted to showcase one last deck for anybody out there who's a wild format player. This is a take on Mech Hunter again, but the wild version specifically, which is similar in some ways to the standard format Mech Hunter, but far less reliant on bombs and more about just perfect on-curve mech aggression. As you'll see here, not really a lot of bomb-driven cards specifically. There's a handful of leftovers, but really just about hitting that early curve with powerful openers like Cogmaster, really high-tempo plays via Mech Warper, some still powerful magnetic stuff, follow-ups like Metal Tooth Leaper that do a ton of damage to your board, and Snip Snap, again, when you're playing on curve, you're utilizing magnetic in a powerful way, is absolutely perfect. Super sticky minion, strong follow-up damage, good independently and in combination with other cards, so it's exactly what a deck like this needs. So absolutely, Snip Snap will make the cut for Mech Hunter, and this is another very powerful list that's a high-tier deck in Wild. So if you are a Wild format player, throwing Snip Snap into a list like this is going to certainly win you some games and will be a very reliable deck in the Rise of the Mech event. You pretty much can't go wrong with this one. And there you go, folks. That's it for my 5 decks for Snip Snap. I think this is going to be a really cool little card that gets played in a lot of different decks, but these are 5 of the more obvious and reliable ways to use this card. So go out there, try your luck with Snip Snap. Tell me how it goes. If you have any questions on any of these decks, how to play them, how the meta is going to shape up, I will be hanging around in the comments as much as I can. Happy to discuss it with you a little bit, answer some questions when possible. So keep an eye out there in the comments. But in the meantime, thank you so very much for watching. Appreciate your time. And until next time, game on.